The rope had been salvaged from a demolished supply depot 3 days earlier, its manila fibers already showing signs of wear when Desmond Doss first tested its weight. Now, as dawn broke over the jagged coral cliffs of Hacksaw Ridge in April 1945, he ran his fingers along its length one more time, checking for weak spots, while the 77th Infantry Division prepared for another assault on the plateau above. The rope felt solid enough, but Doss had learned not to trust anything completely on Okinawa, not the weather, not the intelligence reports, and certainly not equipment that had already survived one bombing. Captain Morrison stood nearby, reviewing maps with his squad leaders as rain began to spatter the muddy staging area below the ridge. The sheer limestone face rose nearly 400 feet above them, its top shrouded in morning mist that couldn't quite hide the sound of enemy movement. Japanese positions honeycombed the plateau, connected by tunnels and caves that had turned every previous assault into a nightmare of crossfire and hidden mortars. Morrison had made his opinion of the unarmed medic clear during the pre-dawn briefing, questioning why they were carrying dead weight when ammunition was already running low. Doss absorbed the criticism without response, methodically checking his medical supplies instead. Bandages, sulfur powder, morphine syrettes, and tourniquets filled every available pocket of his pack, leaving no room for the rifle he refused to carry. The other men watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their own weapons cleaned and ready for the climb ahead. Some had grown to respect the quiet medic who had already proven himself in earlier actions across Okinawa, but others still questioned whether a man unwilling to fight belonged on the front lines. The assault plan called for 2 companies to scale the ridge using cargo nets and ladders, establishing a foothold on the plateau before advancing toward the Japanese cave complexes. Intelligence suggested the enemy had pulled back during the night, but Doss had heard similar optimistic assessments before. He coiled the salvaged rope carefully, securing it to his pack alongside a shorter length he hoped to use for lowering wounded men if evacuation became necessary. The weight felt reassuring against his back, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he would need every inch before the day ended. Private Jenkins, a rifleman from Alabama who had initially mocked Doss's convictions, approached with an awkward expression. The young soldier had watched the medic work under fire during the previous week's fighting, dragging wounded men to safety while enemy snipers searched for targets. Now Jenkins extended a canteen without meeting Doss's eyes, a small gesture that spoke louder than any apology. Doss accepted the water gratefully, understanding that combat had a way of stripping away everything except what truly mattered between men. The first mortars began falling at 6:30, Japanese shells seeking the staging area with methodical precision. Doss pressed himself against the coral rock beside Jenkins, feeling the ground shake as explosions walked closer to their position. Fragments whistled overhead, and he heard someone cry out from a neighboring squad, the day's first casualty before the assault had even begun. The sound triggered an automatic response, and Doss found himself reaching for his medical kit, while other soldiers hunched deeper into whatever cover they could find. Morrison's voice cut through the shell bursts, ordering the advance to begin ahead of schedule. The cargo nets swayed against the cliff face as men began climbing, their equipment clanking against the limestone while machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions above. Doss watched the first wave disappear into the mist, knowing that within minutes some of them would need his help. He whispered a brief prayer, the same words he had repeated before every action since landing on Okinawa, and began his own ascent, the rope coiled on his pack, feeling heavier with each upward step. The climb took longer than expected, the nets slick with morning dew, and the coral face crumbling under the weight of heavily loaded soldiers. Halfway up, Doss heard the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons from the plateau above, followed by urgent shouts for medical assistance. The Japanese had not withdrawn after all. They had simply waited for the Americans to climb within range of their prepared positions. By the time Doss hauled himself over the rim of the ridge, 3 men were already down, their blood mixing with the red Okinawan mud, while enemy fire swept the exposed ground. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The plateau stretched before them like a moonscape, pocked with shell craters and the stumps of trees that had been shredded by weeks of artillery. Hacksaw Ridge's infamous cliff edge lay 400 yards across this killing ground, where previous American assaults had stalled against Japanese positions carved into the coral bedrock. Doss dropped into the nearest crater beside Jenkins, who was trying to stop the bleeding from a shrapnel wound on his arm. The morning rain had intensified, turning the Okinawan soil into a slippery mess that made movement treacherous, even without enemy fire. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, reporting their precarious foothold to battalion headquarters while requesting immediate artillery support. The Japanese response came in the form of knee mortars, small shells that dropped with deadly accuracy among the scattered American positions. Doss watched two more men go down near the ridge's eastern edge, their cries for medical assistance barely audible over the constant crack of rifle fire. He began crawling toward them, dragging his medical kit through the mud, while machine gun bullets snapped overhead. The first wounded soldier had taken a round through the shoulder, the bullet missing major arteries but leaving him unable to use his rifle arm. Doss applied pressure to the wound while scanning for a safe evacuation route back to the cliff edge they had climbed. The cargo net still hung against the limestone face, but lowering a wounded man down that route would require exposing both medic and patient to concentrated fire from Japanese observers. The salvaged rope in his pack offered another possibility, if he could find a more sheltered section of the rim where gravity could do most of the work. Jenkins appeared at his elbow, having ignored his own wound to help move casualties. The young rifleman had undergone a complete transformation since their earlier confrontations about Doss's refusal to carry weapons. His skepticism replaced by grudging admiration for the medic's willingness to move forward when others sought cover. Together, they dragged the wounded soldier toward a depression near the ridge's southern edge, where overhanging coral provided minimal shelter from observation. Doss began rigging an improvised stretcher from rifle stocks and shelter halves, while Jenkins kept watch for enemy movement. The second casualty proved more challenging. A machine gunner who had been caught in the open during the initial advance, his leg shattered by a direct hit from a knee mortar. Moving him would require 2 men minimum, and the distance back to any evacuation point looked impossibly far across ground swept by crossfire. Doss applied a tourniquet while considering their options, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The wounded man gripped his arm with surprising strength, eyes wide with pain and the fear of being left behind on the plateau. Morrison crawled up to their position, his uniform torn and muddy from the morning's fighting. The company commander's expression showed the strain of watching his assault disintegrate under prepared Japanese fire, but he maintained the crisp authority expected of an officer. His earlier criticism of Doss seemed forgotten as he helped lift the wounded machine gunner onto the improvised stretcher, recognizing that getting casualties off the ridge had become more important than advancing toward enemy positions. The captain's radio crackled with orders from battalion: hold the current line and prepare for reinforcement, though when that might arrive remained unclear. The evacuation to the rim took 20 minutes of careful movement, with Jenkins and Morrison providing what covering fire they could, while Doss guided the stretcher between shell holes. At the edge, he uncoiled the salvage rope and tested its anchoring points on the coral outcropping, measuring distances and calculating weight loads in his head. The first descent went smoothly, the wounded soldier reaching the aid station below with nothing worse than rope burns on his hands. But as Doss pulled the line back up, he noticed several strands beginning to fray where the manila had rubbed against the sharp coral edge. The machine gunner's evacuation required more complex rigging, his dead weight and splintered leg making the descent treacherous for both patient and rope. Doss played out the line inch by inch, feeling each fiber stretch under the load, while Jenkins called down guidance to the medics waiting below. When the rope finally went slack, signaling a safe arrival, Doss examined the damage with growing concern. The constant friction and heavy loads were taking their toll on equipment that had never been designed for this kind of sustained use. If the day continued at this pace, he might soon face the choice between risking a man's life on deteriorating rope or leaving him on the plateau. More casualties were already calling for assistance from across the ridge, their voices mixing with the sound of renewed Japanese fire. Morrison had disappeared back toward his command post, leaving Doss and Jenkins to continue their improvised rescue operation with whatever equipment they could salvage. The morning rain showed no signs of stopping, and intelligence reports suggested enemy reinforcements were moving into the area under cover of the weather. What had begun as a straightforward assault was evolving into something far more desperate, a test of endurance that would push every man to his limits and beyond. By noon, the rope had saved 8 men from the exposed plateau of Hacksaw Ridge, but Doss could see its condition deteriorating with each rescue. Individual manila fibers snapped under tension, creating weak spots that might fail catastrophically during the next evacuation. The rain had turned heavier, transforming the Okinawan soil into red mud that made footing treacherous near the cliff edge, where he had anchored his improvised lowering system. Japanese artillery had found their range as well, walking shells closer to the American positions with methodical precision that spoke of experienced observers hidden somewhere in the coral caves. Jenkins crouched beside him in the shell crater they had claimed as a temporary aid station, field dressing a shrapnel wound while keeping one eye on the ridge approaches. The young rifleman had appointed himself as Doss's unofficial bodyguard, a role that violated military doctrine but reflected the pragmatic adjustments men made under fire. Their partnership had evolved through the morning's chaos, Jenkins providing security while Doss focused on medical care, both men adapting to the reality that survival depended more on improvisation than regulations. News from other sectors filtered back through wounded men and radio intercepts, painting a grim picture of the 77th Infantry Division's broader assault. Company B had been forced off their section of the ridge after losing half their strength to concentrated mortar fire, while Company D remained pinned down near the eastern approach with no clear route for evacuation. Battalion headquarters kept requesting status updates that Morrison couldn't provide with any certainty. The situation changed too rapidly for formal reporting, and Japanese countermeasures seemed to anticipate every American movement. The afternoon's most difficult case arrived as a rifleman who had been hit during a reconnaissance probe toward the enemy caves. Shrapnel from a concealed mine had torn through his abdomen, creating wounds that required immediate surgery rather than field treatment. Doss worked quickly to stabilize the bleeding while calculating whether the deteriorating rope could support another evacuation under fire. The man's blood pressure was dropping steadily, and moving him too roughly might cause fatal internal injuries, but leaving him on the plateau guaranteed death from blood loss or enemy action. Morrison returned with orders that changed everything. Battalion was pulling back to defensive positions below the ridge, abandoning the day's gains in favor of consolidation and resupply. The withdrawal would begin at 1400 hours, giving Doss less than 30 minutes to evacuate remaining casualties before American artillery began preparation fires for the next day's assault. The captain's expression showed his frustration with decisions made by officers who had never seen the plateau's terrain. But military discipline required compliance regardless of personal opinion. The prospect of abandoning wounded men triggered something deeper than professional obligation in Doss's mind. He had seen retreat before, tactical withdrawals that made perfect sense from a strategic perspective, but felt like betrayal when viewed through the eyes of casualties left behind. His refusal to carry weapons had already marked him as different from other soldiers, and now that difference extended to his interpretation of when the mission truly ended. While others prepared to descend the cargo nets, Doss remained focused on the wounded man whose life hung in the balance of a fraying rope and deteriorating weather. Jenkins faced his own crisis of loyalty, torn between orders to withdraw and his growing bond with the medic who had redefined his understanding of courage. The young rifleman understood military discipline, but he had also watched Doss risk everything repeatedly throughout the day to bring men home alive. Standing at the ridge edge with rain streaming down his face, Jenkins made a decision that would affect both their fates. He would stay behind to help with the final evacuations, regardless of consequences with military authority. The rope held for the critical evacuation, but barely. Doss felt individual strands parting as he lowered the wounded rifleman toward the aid station, each small snap echoing in his mind like gunshots. The man reached safety, but the equipment that had served so faithfully throughout the day was now genuinely dangerous. Any additional weight might cause complete failure, leaving both patient and medic stranded on a plateau that would soon be targeted by American artillery. The sound of other units beginning their withdrawal drifted across the ridge, mixing with Japanese voices as enemy soldiers emerged from their caves to reclaim lost ground. Alone, except for Jenkins, Doss surveyed the plateau one final time, listening for any wounded Americans who might still be alive among the shell holes and coral outcroppings. The official withdrawal was proceeding on schedule, but something inside him refused to accept that the mission was complete. 3 more voices called weakly from different directions, men who had been missed during the earlier evacuations and now faced abandonment or death. His hands trembled as he coiled the damaged rope again, knowing that each additional rescue attempt pushed probability closer to disaster. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The silence that followed the main withdrawal felt more ominous than the morning's gunfire, broken only by distant Japanese voices and the steady patter of rain against coral rock. Doss had made his choice, disobeying direct orders to evacuate in favor of searching for the 3 wounded Americans whose calls still echoed across Hacksaw Ridge's plateau. Jenkins remained beside him, despite repeated urgings to climb down with the others, his loyalty now transcending military regulation in favor of something more fundamental. Together, they moved across ground that would soon be targeted by American artillery, guided by instinct and fading voices toward casualties hidden among the shell holes. The first man they found had been trapped under equipment from a destroyed machine gun position, his legs pinned but otherwise uninjured. Freeing him required careful lifting that exposed both rescuers to observation from Japanese positions now stirring to life across the ridge. Enemy soldiers were emerging from their caves and tunnels, reclaiming territory they had defended throughout the morning, while preparing for the next American assault. Doss worked quickly to extract the trapped soldier, while Jenkins provided what security one rifleman could manage against an entire defensive network. Moving the rescued man back to their improvised aid station required a route that skirted active Japanese positions, adding precious minutes to a timeline already compressed by approaching artillery. The wounded soldier could walk with assistance, reducing the load on their compromised rope system. But his movement was slow and painful across terrain churned by hours of shell fire. Doss supported him on one side while Jenkins scanned for enemy movement, both men understanding that their window for evacuation was closing rapidly, regardless of how many casualties remained on the plateau. The rope's condition had deteriorated beyond any reasonable safety margin, individual strands parting even under the reduced load of a walking wounded. Doss played out each foot of line with exaggerated care, feeling the manila fibers stretch and snap while he lowered the soldier toward the aid station below. When the rope finally went slack, he pulled it back up to find several sections worn nearly through where constant friction had abraded the natural fibers. The next evacuation might be their last, regardless of how many men still needed rescue from the plateau above. Japanese mortar fire began falling around their position as enemy observers pinpointed the American activity near the cliff edge. Small shells dropped with increasing accuracy while Doss and Jenkins searched for the remaining casualties, their calls now weaker and more difficult to locate among the explosions. Time was running out in multiple dimensions. American artillery would begin firing soon. Japanese patrols were advancing across the plateau, and their evacuation rope was approaching complete failure under repeated stress. They found the second man unconscious in a crater 50 yards from the ridge edge, his pulse weak but steady despite obvious blood loss from multiple wounds. Moving him would require the stretcher system Doss had improvised earlier, but that meant trusting the damaged rope with a full deadweight load that might exceed its remaining strength. Jenkins helped construct the litter while keeping watch for Japanese soldiers, his ammunition running low after the day's fighting. Both men understood they were approaching the moment when choices became irrevocable. The evacuation proceeded with agonizing slowness, each inch of descent testing rope fibers that audibly parted under tension. Doss controlled the lowering from above while Japanese fire searched for his position, bullets striking the coral rim with sharp cracks that sent rock fragments spinning into space. The wounded man reached the aid station alive, but pulling the rope back up revealed damage that made further use genuinely suicidal. Several sections had been reduced to less than half their original strength, and the anchor points were beginning to cut through the manila, where sharp coral edges concentrated stress. The third casualty remained somewhere on the plateau, his voice growing weaker with each call as shock and blood loss took their toll. Finding him required movement across ground, now actively patrolled by Japanese soldiers, while evacuating him would demand equipment that had already been pushed beyond safe limits. Doss faced the hardest decision of his military service: accept that he had done everything humanly possible, or risk everything on one final rescue that might cost 3 lives instead of saving 1. Jenkins made the choice easier by refusing to abandon the search, despite ammunition that had dwindled to his final magazine. The young rifleman, who had once mocked Doss's convictions, now embodied the same stubborn refusal to accept unacceptable losses. Together they moved toward the sound of the wounded man's voice, crossing a plateau that belonged increasingly to their enemies, while American artillery prepared to reclaim it with high explosives. The rope coiled on Doss's pack felt like both salvation and trap, their only means of evacuation, but equipment that might fail at the worst possible moment. What the citation would later describe as miraculous courage under impossible circumstances felt like controlled terror from inside Doss's mind as he knelt beside the third casualty, a young replacement who had been on Okinawa for less than a week. The soldier had taken shrapnel through both legs and was fading in and out of consciousness, while Japanese voices grew louder across Hacksaw Ridge's plateau. The boy looked impossibly young, barely old enough to shave, and kept calling for his mother between moments of lucidity that made Doss's chest tighten with recognition of his own fears. The rope that had saved so many lives throughout the day now represented a calculated gamble that might end all 3 of theirs. Doss examined the damaged sections one final time, finding weak points where individual strands had parted under repeated stress. The manila fibers were worn through in several places, reduced to perhaps 60% of their original strength, while the coral edge that served as their anchor point had cut deeper grooves with each evacuation. Military engineering would have condemned the equipment hours ago, but military engineering wasn't trapped on a plateau with artillery incoming. Jenkins had positioned himself between their location and the nearest Japanese patrol, his final magazine loaded and ready despite odds that made resistance almost meaningless. The young rifleman understood they were beyond rational calculation now, operating in the space where men discovered what they truly believed about themselves and each other. His earlier skepticism about Doss's convictions had been replaced by something deeper, recognition that faith, regardless of its object, could produce results that pure pragmatism couldn't achieve. The evacuation rigging took longer than usual because Doss checked every knot twice, understanding that haste might mean death for all concerned. He secured the unconscious replacement in the improvised stretcher while listening to American artillery shells whistle overhead toward Japanese positions deeper on the plateau. The bombardment provided temporary cover, but also marked the approaching end of their window for evacuation. Once the guns fell silent, enemy patrols would sweep the ridge systematically, looking for wounded Americans and equipment. The rope began stretching immediately under the dead weight, individual fibers popping with small sounds that made Doss's heart race. He controlled the descent inch by inch, feeling each snap through his hands, while Jenkins provided what covering fire he could against Japanese soldiers, moving closer to their position. The wounded replacement swayed at the end of the line like a pendulum, unconscious and unaware that his life hung on equipment pushed far beyond any reasonable safety margin. Halfway down the cliff face, disaster struck. A section of rope parted suddenly, dropping the stretcher 6 feet before the remaining strands caught the load with a jerk that nearly pulled Doss over the edge. The wounded soldier's body bounced against the limestone, and for a moment the entire rescue seemed doomed to end in tragedy. But the remaining fibers held, and Doss resumed the descent with hands that shook uncontrollably, while his mind repeated prayers he had learned in childhood Sunday school. The smell of wet rope and coral dust would stay with him for decades, triggered by rainstorms that brought everything back in vivid detail. The replacement reached the aid station alive but unconscious, his evacuation representing both triumph and the end of their rescue capabilities. The rope that had saved 11 men during the day's fighting was now genuinely useless, its remaining sections too damaged for any further weight. Pulling it back up revealed the full extent of the damage. A tool that had been essential for survival reduced to frayed hemp, unsuitable for any critical application. Doss coiled the remnants automatically, unable to discard something that had meant the difference between life and death for so many casualties. Jenkins appeared at his elbow, ammunition exhausted, but still carrying his rifle out of habit and regulation. Japanese soldiers were advancing across the plateau in extended line, searching methodically for any Americans who might have been left behind during the withdrawal. The two men faced their own evacuation down cargo nets that swayed against the cliff face under increasing enemy fire, understanding that their unauthorized rescue mission was approaching its final phase regardless of their personal survival. The descent felt endless, despite taking only minutes, both men slipping and sliding down rope nets made treacherous by rain and the accumulated wear of a day's combat. Enemy bullets struck the cliff face around them, sending coral fragments spinning into space while they fought gravity and equipment failure with muscles exhausted by hours of rescue operations. When they finally reached the aid station, Doss's first instinct was to check on the casualties he had evacuated, counting faces and wounds to ensure that his count was accurate. 11 men owed their lives to a rope salvaged from a demolished supply depot, but the weight of that knowledge felt heavier than pride. What the official reports would describe as heroic action had felt like a series of increasingly desperate improvisations, each successful evacuation making the next one more dangerous as equipment deteriorated and enemy pressure increased. The gap between public perception and private reality would grow wider with time, leaving Doss to carry memories that medals couldn't adequately represent or explain to those who hadn't stood at that cliff edge. The aid station below Hacksaw Ridge operated with the controlled chaos of military medicine under fire. Medics and corpsmen working by lamplight under canvas that barely muffled the sound of artillery exchanges above. Dr. Hayes, a reserve officer from Pennsylvania who had been processing casualties since dawn, looked up from his surgery as Doss stumbled through the entrance with mud-caked equipment and hands rope-burned raw from the day's evacuations. 11 stretchers held the men who had been lowered from the plateau, some conscious and talking, others unconscious from wounds or exhaustion, all alive because one medic had refused to abandon the ridge when ordered to withdraw. The damaged rope lay coiled in the corner where Doss had dropped it, no longer useful for anything requiring strength or reliability. Dr. Hayes examined it briefly while Doss reported on each casualty's condition and treatment, noting the improvised knots and the sections where individual strands had parted under stress. The medical officer had seen enough combat to understand what sustained evacuation under fire cost in terms of equipment and human endurance, but the extent of what one man had accomplished with salvaged rope and stubborn determination exceeded anything in his experience. Jenkins sat on an ammunition crate, his rifle finally unloaded after a day that had transformed him from skeptic to believer in the kind of courage he had once dismissed as impractical. The young rifleman watched Doss move between casualties, checking bandages and offering quiet words of reassurance despite exhaustion that made his hands tremble. The bond forged between them during the ridge fighting would outlast the war, but Jenkins already understood that carrying such memories required strength different from what military training provided. Captain Morrison arrived 2 hours after the last evacuation, his expression mixing relief with embarrassment as he surveyed the casualties that unauthorized action had saved. The company commander faced a complex situation, disciplining subordinates who had disobeyed direct orders, while simultaneously recognizing that their disobedience had produced results no regulation could have achieved. Military efficiency demanded adherence to orders, but military humanity celebrated outcomes that transcended institutional limitations. He settled for documenting the rescues while avoiding detailed questions about timing and authorization. The replacement soldier who had been evacuated last remained unconscious, his condition stabilized but serious enough to require evacuation to a field hospital. Dr. Hayes worked over him, while Doss provided details about wounds and treatment, their conversation a mixture of medical terminology and practical combat medicine that bridged the gap between formal training and battlefield improvisation. The boy would survive, though his war was probably over before it had truly begun, another name on casualty lists that never captured the full cost of individual survival. News from the ridge indicated that Japanese forces had reoccupied the plateau, erasing the day's territorial gains while consolidating defensive positions for the next American assault. The 77th Infantry Division would attack again within 48 hours, using lessons learned from the day's fighting to modify tactics and equipment allocation. The cycle would continue until one side or the other lacked the strength to continue, but the human cost of each attempt grew heavier as both armies approached the limits of endurance that modern warfare demanded. Doss found himself staring at the damaged rope, remembering each evacuation and the feeling of individual fibers parting under his hands. The manila strands had held when engineering calculations suggested they should fail, supporting loads that exceeded safe working limits through what could only be called faith, in equipment, in purpose, and in the stubborn refusal to accept unacceptable losses. That rope would never appear in official reports, but it represented something more important than regulations could capture or medals could adequately honor. Years later, during quiet moments in civilian life, the smell of wet hemp would trigger memories of that day on Hacksaw Ridge with startling clarity. Doss would remember Jenkins's transformation from critic to ally, Morrison's struggle between orders and conscience, and Dr. Hayes's quiet professionalism while treating casualties evacuated against regulations. But mostly, he would remember the voices calling for help across that hellish plateau, and the weight of rope in his hands as he lowered each man towards safety one final time. The after-action reports would compress 12 hours of chaos into several paragraphs of clinical prose, noting casualties evacuated and ground gained, then lost to enemy counterattack. But the men who survived that day would carry different memories, of improvised courage that transcended training, of equipment pushed beyond safe limits by stubborn determination, and of the thin line between heroic legend and terrified prayer that defined combat's truest moments. The rope that made it all possible would be discarded as unserviceable, its contribution forgotten, except by those who understood what salvation sometimes looked like on the battlefield. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.